This meeting is being recorded.
Wow, that's new. Welcome to the Popular Music, Books, and Process series. All events this fall are scheduled for Tuesdays at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Email froyster@depaul.edu to be added to the series email and to get Zoom links. You can watch the video of all the presentations on Eric Weisbard's YouTube channel soon after the event happens. You can find the whole calendar for the series on the ISBM US website under the Journal tab. The series is co-organized by Kimberly Mack, Francesca Royster, Gus Stadler, Carl Wilson, and with me, Antonia Randolph, sitting in for Eric Weisbard this year. Eric is abroad. He'll join as often as he can, given the fact that he's abroad. The series is sponsored by the Journal of Popular Music Studies, IASPM US, and the Pop Conference. Next week, we will have Evelyn McDonald, The World According to Joan Didion, a book from HarperCollins, in conversation with Ann Powers. So that's next week, November 28th. Today we have John Szwed, author of Cosmic Scholar, The Life and Times of Harry Smith, by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, in conversation with Nick Spitzer. And I'll give the bio of both of our presenters. John Szwed is the author of the biographies of Billie Holiday, Miles Davis, Sun Ra, Alan Lomax, and books such as Crossovers, Essays on Race, Music, and American Culture, African American Anthropology, After Africa, Slave Culture in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century British West Indies, and Jazz 101. He has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, and in 2005, he was awarded Grammy for Dr. Jazz, a book included with Jelly Roll Morton, The Complete Library of Congress Recordings by Alan Lomax. A former chair of the Department of Folklore and Folklife at the University of Pennsylvania and director of the Center of Urban Ethnography, he was also professor of anthropology, African American studies, and film studies at Yale University, and professor of music and jazz studies, and the director of the Center for Jazz Studies at Columbia University, where he's adjunct senior research scholar. Szwed has written for The Village Voice, The New York Times, The Wire, and other publications. And he'll be in conversation with Nick Spitzer. Nick Spitzer is the host and producer of the public radio program American Roots and professor of anthropology at Tulane University. Beginning as a PhD in Philadelphia and Austin, he has been a documentary, record, film, festival, and exhibit curator and record TV and film producer for Arhoolie, Rounder, and Folkways Records, the Smithsonian Folklife Festival, PBS Great Performances, the National Black Programming Consortium, NPR's All Things Considered, and ABC's Nightline. He was the Louisiana State folklorist, created the Louisiana Folklife Pavilion at the Louisiana World Exposition, produced the Louisiana Folklife Recording Series, and edited Louisiana Folklife, A Guide to the State. He directed the radio concert series Folk Masters at Carnegie Hall and Wolf Trap Foundation for the Performing Arts, the American Roots Independence Day Concert, and NPR broadcasts from the National Mall. His film, Zydeco, was shown on PBS. Spitzer received the Guggenheim for work documenting lives and cultures in Afro-French, Louisiana, the Benjamin Botkin Award of the American Folklore Society, and support for major projects from the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. In 2023, he was named the Best Lomax Hawes National Heritage Fellow by the National Endowment for the Arts in 2023. Place your questions in the chat, and Carl will lead the Q&A after the conversation, where he will ask you to unmute to ask your question. Also, you can use the chat for comments and discussion. And now I'll turn it over to John and Nick.
Thank you. Well, this is like being in New Orleans. You get an introduction, and by the time everyone's introduced, the session is over. So I apologize for longevity on my behalf, at least. I won't apologize for John because I always love hearing what John's worked on, and I've known him for about 50 years. I was an undergraduate student of his, and John, I was getting into folklore and I was really into jazz, and John convinced me that modern jazz, bebop, and beyond was folk music, and I never looked back from that idea because I think the thought was that people were learning from one another in small groups, exchanging ideas. Many of the major institutes of jazz studies had not yet emerged, and of course, living in New Orleans, we always hear the influence of deep traditional arts and culture of all kinds in New Orleans jazz and brass bands that have come later and everything else. So I owe a great deal to the understanding of the world through the work and ideas and conversations with John over half a century. But I thought I would ask John to indulge us by reading from the opening of Cosmic Scholar, which is an amazing book that gets him on the road to helping us understand Harry Smith.
Well, that's the first time I'm reading this in print, so I hope I won't be surprised. I'm standing on the ruined shell of the 19th century glass factory in Red Hook, the far fringes of Brooklyn. Shards of glass are crunching under my feet. Stacks of more than 120 shipping boxes surround me, enough to fill a small New York apartment floor to ceiling. They contain the books and records of Harry Everett Smith, at least those that survived his life on the streets and other people's homes in rooms paid for by somebody else. This building will soon be converted to artist studios, ateliers, workshops where things were created, thoughts made visible, spaces that Smith never had in his life. But for now, it's a warehouse of Smithiana. The first boxes I open up are filled with what must be thousands of long-playing records, Library of Congress folk song albums made of all the countries, music with all the countries in the world, the stacks of discs by Charlie Parker, Pink Floyd, Shel Silverstein, Thelonious Monk, Cajun singers and musicians, the Chieftains, and this Grand Ole Opry, church sermons, raunchy proto-rap and comedy skits, New Orleans parades, bootleg Bob Dylan, square dance music, Lomax's field recordings, bird songs, blues, American Indian chants, and in other boxes lie the journals and magazines, runs of the American Anthropologist, the African Arts, American Bee Journal, that's B-E-E, Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research, Biotechnology, Oral History, Blake Studies, Ancient Indian Tradition and Mythology, Nature, and Howard the Duck, and dozens more. The books are next, but thousands of them on folklore, linguistics, and ethnography. Lots of Yeats and Yates, that's Y-A-T-E-S and Y-E-A-T-S. Books on board and table games, Native Americans, dreaming, divination, apocrypha, and pseudograph. Can I pronounce these words? Pseudopographia, the Dogon, Santeria, beaches, spiders, Yoruba headgear, and histories of rain. Children's books, Lewis Carroll, Leonardo da Vinci, Cosmic Plasma, Effects of Low Frequency Magnetic and Electric Fields. Claude Lévi-Strauss is the origin of table manners from Anthology, a book on table setting for all occasions. It's not the same book, it's another one. Concordances to Shakespeare and Faulkner. I have to stop. I should be stopping reading too, but I have to stop reading these boxes because I feel like I'm entering Borges's Library of Babel, a universe of books and records, or maybe a labyrinth of paper and vinyl as there's no order to it, and constant's random and seemingly meaningless. My temptation is to read and listen to every one of them in hopes of at least finding the meaning behind Harry Smith, the reader and listener, but then I thought I might never be able to write the book, or worse, maybe my book is in there already written. And how did I get here? And who's Harry Smith? And why am I even writing this book? And behind that question, which I've asked myself, why am I even writing this book? Why am I writing a book about somebody who doesn't want his life known? And it's going to I'm not overstating that. He did his best to either, well, as they say, I'm trying to think of a nice word for lying. Lying about his background, and maybe even trickier, keeping his friends apart from each other so they didn't know what they were dealing with. And he extended this to cutting off his family after the time he was roughly early 20s, 23, and had no dealings with them thereafter, or with any other people, or never went back to the Northwest where he was born. In effect, he had erased his entire history. Now, what kind of crazy person would write a book like this? I'll answer that by saying a person who wrote a book about a man who claimed he wasn't human, who kept changing his name, who kept changing his orchestra's name. And Sun Ra had gone to enormous efforts to say, I'm not one of y'all. All y'all are human, I'm not. But Harry was tougher because he didn't leave the trail that Sun Ra did.
Well, John, I think most people know of Harry Smith, if they know of him, through the Anthology of American Folk Music. And, Jerry Garcia said that it set him up to play the repertoire he did with the Grateful Dead and many other people in jazz and traditional music, rhythm and blues, folk, you name it, all the categoricals, in some way or another seem to have known about the anthology. But the book reveals so much more than the anthology, as well as the accidental properties of the Anthology of American Folk Music, which was this first big collection, you could almost call it a bootleg, of 78s produced in the 1950s and followed by people that were into music. So I guess the question does come back. What gave you the energy and the willpower to go ahead and write from what I can tell, the most difficult biography you've had to work on or chosen to work on?
Well, I think I don't like to answer the question because I fear the answer. I think I didn't view them as biographies, and somehow that freed me not to have to say, well, the trick of biography, as far as I could see, and I can't see very far with it, is you're supposed to know the person as well as you know yourself, maybe even better, or at least they write it that way, because they'll say things like, he should have known, or she must have been there, and she, I don't know what the term for that would be, a kind of guesswork, whatever. It's guessing in somebody's head. It can get in their head, and the idea that you could write a book about somebody's life is really ludicrous when you think about it, because you'd have to live as long as they did to do it. Plus, you'd have to live as the life of the people they dealt with, and you're talking now into millions of years, probably, as it works out. So what are you doing? You're putting out a picture of a person, and you hope you get it right, or you hope you get something right. And the problem with that, I thought, and why I'm not really crazy about biographies, is that everyone's already got a biography of these people in their heads. So you're walking with another one, and one of the first troubles I had with the Miles Davis book was I ran into someone at a bar in Soho, and he said, "Oh, you're doing Miles? Let me tell you." He told me this ludicrous story that it couldn't be possible by time, place, or even anything. I knew it was wrong. I said, "Where'd you hear that?" And he acted shocked, and he said, "Whoa, you want provenance? You want proof of this? You want Miles belongs to everybody, man." And I thought, damn, this is the good part. Everybody will be interested. That was a mistake. The other is, this is the bad part, because they're all walking around with their own picture. Now, you hit Billie Holiday. I was lucky enough to find the original draft of her autobiography, which had been edited by editors and lawyers because of fear that the names of her lovers would end in a lawsuit. So she wanted people to know these things. And there were some pretty important people there. And, I won't go into detail, but they were much more important. And what to me, that said that Holiday moved in a much wider circle than we'd come to know. And she had been one of the hoi polloi as well as the funky folks. She'd moved the whole thing. I mean, that was one part of what led me on that book was I really wanted to say that, and I never really got it clear, I think, that she is telling us in her autobiography that every American institution had let her down, from school to prison to music and so forth, and that she has survived all this. And I thought, this is an incredible person. So I put the things back in, and one reviewer said I was dropping names. Well, it was her names, it was the life. And I thought, this is the problem. Someone's got their own Billie Holiday in their head. So I didn't, all right, my point is, I didn't think these were biographies. I thought they were puzzles. I thought they were mysteries. And I was dying to know how you, in the case of Smith, even when I thought he was a much narrower person than I came out to be, I wanted to know how you could survive in New York for 40 years and never have a job. And, it still puzzles me. In the case of Sun Ra, I wanted to know how a person could transform himself into a non-human and yet get gigs for 50 years with a band and make a life out of it. I thought these were, now what I didn't know at the time, if I'm going on too long, let me know. I really hadn't read Virginia Woolf's later works on biography. She wrote some early ones that were, she saw the bad signs coming, that the early biographies of saints and heroes were going to give way to sleazy, self-revealing and not self-revealing lives of people. And she wanted to think that literature and as fiction could come together with literature as nonfiction. And that's the only way it would survive as a great category. Well, I read that stuff, but I hadn't read what she said about eccentric writers. She said, in every age, there are writers who are eccentrics, and by that she means out of the center. They're off to the sides. And these are the people who you don't hear about. They don't have biographies written about them. And these are people, nonetheless, who are shaping the people who are in the center, even if it's partial. And they shape the times they're in. And she goes on at some length with that. And then she says near the end, these people who are seen to be strange or outside never for one instant believe that they are strange or outside. They think you're strange and outside. And that I thought was describing both Sun Ra and Harry Smith in the same way. And then she ends up by saying, and that's why no good biographies are ever written of these people. And I said, yeah, that hurts. But I take her point. I mean, how do you write something about someone who is so far outside the circle that you'll never reach it? When I quit writing the Harry book when I was running out of steam, because I kept finding new Harrys, and people would say, "Oh, I didn't know that." And the person who told me would say, "You didn't know that?" And how many cells has this guy got, and how much is there left? So I'll leave it to somebody else to keep beating the bushes on that.
Well, of course, just in summary, Harry Smith painted on film. He was an avant-gardist. He was something of a self-made ethnographer in anthropology and folklore. He was, somebody that went between the latest media, and at the same time, early on, was maybe at the age of 14, I think you described him as on a Native American reservation in California, recording traditional chants and sacred material. So, I mean, it's, and then when I finally interviewed him in the 80s, it was a very perplexing interview. It was at Allen Ginsberg's apartment. And I actually turned to John to help me understand what he was talking about. It was probably the single most difficult interview I've ever done, and I've done about 2,000 of them. But we made a show out of it, and I'll just parenthetically say you can go to the American Roots website at some point and hear the voice of Harry Smith, who made a proclamation, which was, I'm proud to be an American, so I was able to break the laws here. So, yeah, I mean, and John, when you give the long list of attributes of Harry Smith's life and work, you usually do end with the word bum. So maybe you could take us to something that people relate to, which is the teenager riding the bicycle with the sound recording equipment out to the Native American place and trying to record songs with folks.
Well, two things puzzle me about that. One is why, Native Americans have learned not to be too cavalier at inviting people in, because they get, on one hand, mystery series written about them, on the other, they're a bunch of drunks or whatever. On the other, they're the real hippies. Or, they keep being cast in these roles that are not of their making. So there's lots of reason for them to not want you even to come on the res with a notebook. But Harry came on with a disc cutting record player and with an auto battery and a bunch of heavy discs. and notebooks and cameras. And when I asked Bill Holm, who was the doyen of Northwest Coast Native American art, great scholar, who went with him, I said, how did you guys carry that stuff up there? How did you get there? He couldn't remember how they got there. He said, maybe it's bikes. I said, you couldn't carry that stuff on a bike. He said, I don't really know. Well, anyway, there they are. And now the question is, why are they being allowed to record things which were technically illegal? That is, the U.S. government had laws against certain kinds of religious things up until the 50s that to encourage what? It's a jokey way to put it, to encourage integration into America when in fact they were being sent out on arrests and what have you. So, but that was it. And even Canada, it wasn't until the 60s that these laws were taken out. So Harry is technically breaking the law just by going to them. But why did they let him in? Why did they let him record on all the things that could be used against him? Or if they were thinking that way, that their kids would be drawn away to by not television yet, but by radio records and all these other things, bicycles and the like. And here comes this other kid, a white kid they don't know from Adam, and he's like undersized and bent over and not exactly your usual teenager. And they not only pour their hearts out to him, some of those things that have disappeared were his things that took months to do, writing down the history of the chiefs of in this case would have been the Lummi Indians who the chief had to sit with him, and he was writing the languages down, which meant he had to do phonetic transcription. It's unbelievable, absolutely unbelievable. I wouldn't have taken any one of those things as an adult if you paid me, because it's almost unbelievable. And another sad part, of course, is that most of that's been lost.
Well, John, maybe that's sort of a category. Him recording Native Americans, and we think of him then making the anthology later. But you have also talked about his life in the New York avant-garde and out west, sort of the West Coast of the West Village, and maybe you could say a little bit about his role involved in painting on film and the visual arts.
Yeah, these things are all connected, but and I don't quite know how to connect them except to say that there's I suppose you could say Harry had a thought, maybe he believed that all things were connected. Now, that's not a totally original idea. You find it in some religions, some philosophies, and so on. But he took it to mean, as he told one of his acolytes, the meaning of a thing we know only because it's sitting next to another thing. And he's being very concrete about it. A block is sitting next to a book or whatever. I don't know. So, but he believed this, and he believed these things. He believed that any kind of music could go with any kind of visual material, which is pretty interesting to me. And he doesn't elaborate, but the idea is that the brain must be handling some way in which it recalibrates the rhythms of both the film and the music. But then Harry tried various techniques of what you might call translation, transposition, whatever, of one art form into another. So he after he had built up his huge record collection, and as a kid he went to Berkeley, where he discovered bebop, which was reaching California a little later than New York. And he particularly discovered Dizzy Gillespie. And what fascinated him, and I don't think I spent enough time in the book talking about this, that Gillespie was himself fascinated with Cuban music and had hired in a great Cuban drummer to work with him. And they had to integrate their rhythms and so forth. So he's taking on a subject which is already difficult rhythmically as jazz, but now he's got another rhythm on top of it. And we get off the subject by when it went this way, but the drummers had a problem. How do we work with this guy? This hand drummer is doing something radically different. Well, Dizzy would say, don't worry, it will work out. So he got these records, things like Manteca and Aldo Bueno, and then he painted them, attempting not to paint how they felt or the musicians performing them. Other people have done that, but literally saying these dots mean rhythm. These strokes mean phrases. This is something. Then to put these things in a picture which will never be the same each time, not just because of the content, because one will be in the form of a Kabbalah, and another will be in the form of a maze, and so on. So even the pictures will be changed. So he's introducing all these complexities that say you have to do this and this and this to do this. And then, a musician friend said to me, well, all right, assuming this, could I play it? I said, yeah, you could if you sat with him and got the, what does this represent? And then I said, but, you have a lot of mistakes. And he said, well, so what? The transcriptions of jazz into music invariably have mistakes. In fact, Thelonious Monk made mistakes on his own transcriptions, on his own material. So that's not a problem. But he wasn't doing it for that reason. He wanted to show you that these things were connected in some way. And why? Because it took, at least a year to do one of them, and one of them he gave up on after 5 years. It was Charlie Parker's Coco. It's too complex. And when Allen Ginsberg met him at the 5 Spot in New York, famous dive for artists and musicians, he saw this guy that looked like he was 80, but he's only maybe 35, I guess. I don't know. And he's sitting there puzzling over things on paper, and he says, what are you doing? He said, I'm trying to figure out whether Monk is coming in before the beat or the after beat on this. Well, it's live, so you only got one chance to do it. It's a fool's errand, but he was coming every night to do this, sitting beside the piano. So it's somehow all of these things he did, and the things that I didn't even spend time with because I was going crazy with it, he was fascinated by store windows. He would spend hours studying how they were done and what was in them. He also threw bricks through them, but that's another story. So his enormous fascination and his belief that everything is connected put him in a different place. I happen to have, I'm an incurable, curious person. I took some dancing lessons, I took acting lessons, all kinds of stuff, psychiatric stuff, just for the fun of it. I wanted to see how this works. And I didn't learn much, but I learned it was hard. And Harry just plunges ahead. He doesn't care if anyone reads it or not. In fact, the last of his friends from Berkeley, this had been in the 1950s, said that Harry was working on a book on the languages of Northwest Coast Indians, but only for himself. He was never going to show it to anybody. So if he's an anthropologist, he obviously would not get tenure. In fact, I was lucky to even keep tenure writing these books. That's another story.
John, you had an event, I guess it was not too long ago at the Whitney, isn't that right?
Mm-hmm.
And how did the Whitney crowd react to both, I guess, the visual aspects of Harry Smith's productions, which I assume was some of the films, but also paintings and other things? I mean, at this point, Harry Smith, it seems to me, has reached well beyond the old folk core of people like John Sebastian and Jerry Garcia. There's a whole new crowd: Alvin Youngblood Hart, the Black Keys, Amethyst Kia, even Marianne Faithfull's in the mix. There's all these artists that kind of lionized them over a very long period. But I just was curious as to how the Whitney audience coming out for Harry Smith and for your presence, what was your sense of their response?
Well, I saw the I saw the crowd at the pre-opening, and then went in one other time and so forth. The first thing I noticed was the age level was remarkably diverse, from very young people to very old. And by the way, a few weeks later, I went to the Brooklyn Folk Festival, and the same thing. The range of it's much wider. I mean, it's easy to say, oh, older people do this or that too, but this was really a 50-50 kind of thing. People who seem to share a wide range. I mean, this is not to say that they're all on the same track. That some of the things being sung as folk songs at the folk festival included "I'm in the Mood for Love" and Betty Boop songs and so forth. But whatever, it's all folk. Who said that? Yes,
Louis Armstrong, I think, had a comment.
Louis Armstrong
You've
said
never heard a horse singing it.
It was Thelonious Monk to Dylan. Dylan says in his book that he Cafe Wall, maybe he was there early for for the evening. Cecil's using the piano, and Cecil is that's not your usual pianist, to put it lightly. The guy destroyed pianos in his feverish playing. So Dylan sits with him and he says, "What do you do?" He said, I play folk music." And Cecil said, "We all play folk music, right?" And then they proceeded to play "River Is Wide" together. Yeah, I don't guess at what Harry was up to because, first of all, I don't have it all. And the parts that puzzle me, and I didn't even try to explain, although I quoted other people explaining, why would someone destroy work that took him years to do and say, I was only interested in the doing, and now that I know I can do it, I'm not concerned with it.
Mm.
He was not interested in selling. I mean, the guy was, many times completely broke and bad health, and he's still not selling stuff, turning away people. By the way, if I can squeeze in one short thing by Harry, he was asked by somebody who wanted to do a paper on him somewhere about his life. And he said, now, if you'd like to ask any questions regarding specific points, regarding names, dates, places, events, lawsuits, attempted suicides, attempted keeping other people from committing suicide, total lack of identification, the fact that I've not paid my taxes for 40 years, I've never voted, I've never had a driver's license, I only wear clothing other people threw away, and I've never been in the army, and I'm always behind in the rent. This would make him the quintessential bohemian, of course. He has no home, he has no fixed place of reference. And then, one more quote from, this is from the filmmaker Andrew Noren, who was meeting him once, and meeting Harry was always, we would have said at one point, a trip, but I'd say it could be a terrifying trip, a bad trip. He sat down beside him. He said, he told me about the relationship between the Elder Eddas and the ceremonial mask of the Bellacoola tribe of the coast of Washington State, and how these related to Seminole textiles and to the music of Heinrich Bieber and the partitas of J.S. Bach and the poetry of Robert Desnos. It was an amazing performance. You could practically see the sparks flying out of his head. At first, I thought this was all brilliant but preposterous. In fact, I had no idea what he was talking about. But then I listened more closely, and it began to seem plausible and even logical. He often had that effect on people, and needless to say, I was stunned and enchanted by him. Finally, he stopped talking abruptly. He leaned forward and whispered, "Can you lend me 20?" Well, others, one of his mentors, not mentors, his backers, Jonas Mekas, the godfather of alternative film, his meeting with Harry was Harry said, "I'm Harry Smith and I hate you." Or other, what's her name? Village poet located on the West Coast. It'll come to you in a second. She finished a reading and Harry attacked her saying, "You're giving away the secrets of something or other." She said she'd never heard of the secrets, had no idea what she was talking about. Harry said, "I'm going to fix you for this."
No, he seemed to get along very, very well with Allen Ginsberg. Could you say a little bit about that relationship?
Well, he did until what I didn't appreciate about although I'd certainly been around him a bit, I didn't appreciate complexity of the life that how he was leading. He was always supporting like 5 or 6 people, and some if people were in prison, he'd be trying to get them out, or he'd be defending somebody's speech or whatever. So he personally was out without money a lot of the time. In fact, for many years, he didn't even charge for readings. He didn't think that was a good thing to do. But Harry comes along and has no income and moves in because he'd had an accident and nobody was taking care of him. So, and then Harry took over. It was hard to live with. Bob Dylan came to visit one night, and Harry was a huge Dylan fan, but he refused to talk to him. And and said, "Turn down the music." They were playing, what was it, Empire Burlesque? Yeah. Any number of people would come and say, "He's not here, you can leave," or he would ask people to leave. So well, at some point, Harry got so expensive. Just living in New York is expensive. It was draining his income. So he's trying to find a way to relocate Harry. And I think you were around him just at the point where he was thinking of going to Mississippi and getting him to stay there. And that didn't work out. Then he took him to Boulder, to the Naropa Institute and did believe it. And this wasn't cruel. Harry actually was like the idea of having his own place and so on. What Alan didn't realize is that in having the luxury to do what he wanted to, that Harry would spend all the money he's giving him to live on books and so with getting sick and not seeing a doctor, not eating. Harry, in one of his last remarks about where things went wrong in his life, he said, I thought for a while if I drank enough I wouldn't have to eat, but that didn't work out. So Alan had a saintly side to him. I mean, it was, he's got to keep these other guys alive and him too. I'm making a picture of Harry seeming to be a thoughtless person. That's not what it is. I'm not sure what it is. His life had become surreal. I mean, he turned himself into a one-person surrealist in a way, and he was operating, well, I guess you could say, in a kind of he's there. You could see him, but he's never what you see. What would you say about that? Surreal.
Well, John, you do detail some of his early years with his parents, I guess, in the Northwest Coast, and you made a comparison or historical comparison between Leonardo da Vinci and Harry early on. Remind me, it was having something to do with looking in the shallows and looking at seaweed and other underwater plants and trying to divine meaning in the image and structure of something very close in the natural realm like that.
Yeah, that was when someone said, I think they said, did you get most of your ideas for painting from surrealism? He said some of them, but most of it from riding around in the little rowboat my father made for me and just watching the kelp motion, the circular movement of kelp. And I was laughing at that till I remembered faintly and looked it up. Leonardo did the same thing and was then converting these things into what concrete directions. We could have flood zones and non-flood zones and so on. So whatever Harry meant by that, he was quite serious, I think. By the way, we should say more about his music in the sense that Harry did plan other anthologies and had at least we had the materials for all of them. One was further material from the Kiowa, love songs, and 79 songs and so forth. He has a couple of anthologies for that, but he had this one that really fascinated me, and he had notes on it on shape note singing. And what fascinated me was that there were shape notes in the shape note singers in the anthology, but he had gotten a whole bunch of them together. He wanted a 3-volume work on it. And he wanted to show that what the real message about American music had been, that so-called ethnic and class differences in music sooner or later interpenetrated, and we weren't really realizing that. He was holding on. He was critical of things like hillbilly versus blues or something, but he was critical in a very different way. And everyone who's written about him seems to not want to see the passage where he says, "What I'm really doing is proving that the music is already totally." He doesn't use miscegenated. He has some strange word for interpenetration, and we don't even know it. So then, when he turns to the shape notes, he said, "There are not many blacks recorded in Shakespeare," but he said, "I don't expect that white composers who were using other people's music all the time, which is that's known, to create their own, they would not be celebrating black composers if they were selling their own. That's an obvious business reason." So Harry got that idea, and then I look at the end of the anthology, and he wants to include 8 or 9 West African and South African religious songs, not the Christian songs. Now, my guess on this is he heard something in there, the parallels and stuff. When I looked at his notes, though, they were the kind of notes that one would expect a serious folklorist to do, such as to make a list of all the key words, well, not many people in folklore studies would do that actually. And then say, what do they mean? So when they says we're going home, what exactly is home? He wants to know. Is it up there? Is it over there? Are they talking? Is it true that you can get high on get a CO2 high by singing too long? These songs going on. He's asking all these questions and wondering what the text mean. He said, "I've got to work on the text." Well, he never finished it because it went on and on. And to give one last example, which I don't think I devote enough time with, he did some avant-garde work with a great musician friend, Chuck Campbell, who 4 flutes worked together in very complex. It was the last record done in the Folkway series, but it didn't come out till years later. And this was really advanced music from 1970 something. And I asked Campbell, did Harry do the notes? Yeah, he did them. They were not like 100 pages. I said, what? He said, but he never mentioned the record. He just talked about flutes.
I would like us to turn, if we could, pretty soon to some Q&A. I see we've got some questions in the chat, but I want to just mention that when I went to see Harry, I was working at the Smithsonian, and Smithsonian had acquired Folkways Records, and the anthology, of course, was kind of considered a very special item in the catalog, and it always had sold well, and it had been, listened to by many different kinds of traditional artists, popular artists of all kinds. And ultimately, we reissued it as a box set. By then, CDs, it certainly wasn't LPs even then. And of course, Harry had started with 78s. And that went on to win a Grammy. And then Harry's visibility rose and rose in popular music to where Dust to Digital, the label that puts out a lot of unusual and rare sides, put out a B-sides collection where they took the 78s and flipped them over and made the B-side collection. And so there's this continuing, certainly, approach to the anthology of American folk music that, as I said, with all the names the younger artists today follow. So that kind of has intrigued me. But before we turn it over, I just had one real final question for you, John. Why did you call it Cosmic Scholar?
That's embarrassing. Remember Cosmic Cowboy?
Yes.
Well, that was it. It just borrowed it. Title's uncopyrightable.
Okay.
That's what's his name?
Which Cosmic Cowboy?
Yeah.
One of the old Austin guys, and I'm not
remembering exactly.
Right now. I just want to be a Cosmic Cowboy. Well, can we turn to questions from people at this point? How should we go about that, Antonio? Do you have a method here that makes sense?
Yeah, I'm actually going to facilitate that. We're still sort of waiting for some more questions to come in. I think everybody's just absorbed in the conversation. Thank you both for that very much. I'll kick it off by asking, you mentioned at one point one of Harry's acolytes, and I'm curious about that relationship because, like, one of the things that seems mysterious about him and his work is that it's hard to get a sense of what his relationship to a public or to an audience or to, anything other than being off on these projects on his own was. And I'm curious how his influence radiated out through the community and through whom and who were key people in that.
Well, I mean, that's some of that came easy because the records at the Smithsonian collection, like the Smithsonian, shows that no one bought the records in the first 10 years except schools and libraries. Virtually nobody else had. Well, we might have one or two here, but part of it was because it was about $240 in today's money to have the whole set. So that's a lot of bread. So there was absolutely no. If people, well, I was going to say if you went to the library you could hear them, but Ralph Rensler and Mike Seeger were bootlegging them themselves, copying the records at night and taking them home and then performing them. So the stuff is getting out in odd ways like that. That was part of it. But a few people, he didn't get any reviews even. I think 8 years later, in a jazz magazine in England, Paul Oliver, the blues guy, said, he's proving to us that whites and blacks are singing the blues, both, but they don't, no one's acknowledging it either way. They're sort of pulling apart. So these weird kind of channels were operating, but then the records, Dave Van Ronk and Dylan were early people to have these people. They borrowed them or someone gave them something. So we're passing them around like that. The audience, I suppose the New Orleans City Ramblers were a major contributor to these songs. Do you think? Some of them, I mean, John Cohen said, I didn't like record number 2, so I never played it, or whatever. They were selective. I do want to say at this point that when I asked Cohen, because he put together was one of the people who put together the Friends of Old Time Music, and they brought the people that Harry had recorded up to New York. I said, so what did Harry think of it? He said, he never went to the concerts. I said, not one of them? No, he had no interest. I said, what was he doing this time? Going to Birdland, listening to jazz. But that's not to say that he had put it all behind him. It wasn't a problem anymore. He'd finished that. He's done with it.
Thanks. We have a question from Jay Gennari. Do you want to unmute and ask?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, especially John and Nick for doing this. So, John, this is a question not so different from Carl's. Is Smith a one-off, or are there folks doing that kind of cultural work still with us? Would we even know about such people?
I've wondered about that in several ways. Every now and then I see someone playing with Harry's idea. In fact, I have one of the recordings. It's a CD that remixes some of those things. I played it for a folk audience once who thought I was going crazy because it was so dense. But it was someone, Harry didn't mix any of those records, that's for sure. But he mixed a lot of things beyond that after that. When he was working with folks and what have you. The question, though, you're making it a little more specific. Are there people like that? The trouble is I can't keep up with things like that. You think with the internet I'd be on top of this stuff, but I don't know. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean the internet and all the related digital technologies. I mean, in a certain way, he seems like absolutely sui generis and kind of a unicorn in terms of the range of materials and the weirdness. But in another sense, given the digital ecosystem and such, it might in a certain way be easier to become that sort of person, or at least a facsimile of such a person.
Yeah, well, there are and Harry in his later years was doing these sort of hanging microphones out the window and recording New York sleeping, so you can actually hear them sleeping. And so and there are people doing things like that now.
Yeah.
Eco recording, because it's possible. And Harry's actually following Tony Schwartz on that. Tony Schwartz is a guy recorded for Folkways, and Schwartz would record anything. And the thing with Schwartz was it's not agoraphobia. What is it when you don't want to leave home? Agoraphobia? Yeah, okay. He didn't want to leave his zip code. So he recorded furiously across, and one of his albums is in New York, whatever the number is, and he stayed in there. So as bizarre as it is, he walks into a movie theater and is recording from that on the street. gypsy players and so forth. But in one, he hears a fire company, it's his apartment on fire. And I was thinking he had to have set fire to the apartment to get that. But so Harry followed him and see, there's a novelist who's got a novel out. Oh boy, I mentioned him in the book, who was influenced by Harry, and he has characters who are doing Harry-like things. Anyone know what I'm talking about here? Middle Eastern name, and he's from England. Anyway, he said Harry's methods led him to do this. So he has his characters wandering around the village recording, things like chess games and bird calls and so forth. But it's something bigger behind that. It's about a record that's mystical and so on. So there's some kind of weird resonances to this stuff. It's like maybe since Nick mentioned the B-sides, some of the B-sides aren't on there because they were ruled to be rude and culturally inappropriate. I can imagine someone bringing out the objectionable B-sides now. By the way, what interested me was racial and ethnic things were considered bad, but the killing and tracking down of women, which is full of, never gets blinked at. So if we're going to start censoring, baby, we get rid of the whole damn music universe. Go back to Beethoven doing Scots folk songs. Hey, forget about obscenity and hip hop and so on. It was white folk music. It was more obscene than that. I mean, some of the squarehead calls were shocking to even tell your friends about. So it's all out there in one way or another. Some of you sound like X-Files here.
One thing about I think Harry that's perplexing to people is that at one level, many of those who came to him came because of the Anthology of American Folk Music, but he also had this large avant-garde audience. And so, the folklorists were sort of seen as, fusty and dusty and wanting authenticity and boiling it down to certain texts and those kinds of things. But Harry treated the folk things that had made it, onto 78s as sort of avant things to be understood or something else to be understood. One of the things I noticed, though, in this new resurgence of interest in him is that these categories of avant, traditional, they have all been sort of transcended for a very long time. And you mentioned Tony Schwartz, and that made me think about him. If you know the history, Tony Schwartz made a famous folkways record called New York 19, which had all the sounds John talked about, and he and Harry ran around and made recordings together. And while I was with Harry that day, every time a fire engine went by, he pulled out a microphone and went to the window. But Tony Schwartz also is most famous for actually having a huge cultural impact through advertising. But his most famous work was the Lyndon Johnson campaign commercial, where the little girl is picking daisies and then the thing crossfades into, a nuclear mushroom cloud. And so I always wondered about that because he seemed so attuned to reaching an audience, both as a commercial sound producer and then, that major piece of political promotion. Whereas Harry struck me as very reclusive and willing to talk, but not in a conversational way, just present and talking about things. And, having grown up around a family of people that were just huge talkers, they did seem to connect most of the time. But Harry, I didn't feel I was having a real conversation with him. And he was saying things that John later helped decode because I didn't know what he was alluding to. So to know him was to try to have studied him. And it leaves you with the questions. But that said, reading the book, I now know so much more because John filled in the blanks.
That little section was the last thing I wrote when I discovered that the 10 years he was first in New York, which is a blank, which nobody seemed to want to talk about. Nobody knew anything about it. I find out that he was hanging out with these extremely wealthy people who were into psycho whatever it was at the time. It was what's his name? Uri Geller kind of crowd. Mrs. Borden and they were multimillionaires. They were all into this psycho whatever they were calling it, and they had the idea, I think, if I've got this right, that anthropology had gotten interested in drugs about the same time. This is 60 something or other, and they were thinking that we got it wrong about the Indians. We really need to have the psycho whatever drugs to know how it works. And Harry was, I think, scamming these people because he was dreaming up weird, electrophobic whatever. And most of the stuff had been debunked. I mean, I think the rich, I don't know what to make of the rich anyway. They spend money on some weird shit. And in this case, they were backing these people who were just, Harry was doing pendulum experiments, getting paid for it, in which he was putting a live chicken on the pendulum and swinging around and measuring with this heat to something or other. And he's doing, or he's doing, at one point he was doing the, I don't want to get into it. I think he was scamming them all, but they didn't care. I mean, this is fun. It was, they were getting inside of metal boxes and then communicating with ancient Egyptians. In some ways, though, yeah, I guess I want to say this. Sometimes the rich are the early hippies. I mean, they don't work. I don't want to get started.
Well, they have leisure time and the freedom to indulge curiosity. And I have to say, I wonder if a Harry Smith could emerge in the current moment. I mean, many people are seeking all kinds of freedom that they feel is limited and there are problems in the social order. But Harry just freely went about doing whatever he could get done, whether it was a scam or an intellectual interest. And there seems to be a life of privilege in that. And yet he went without money and he just sort of lived by, the skin of his teeth. So it's perplexing, but it does seem that there are a lot of people who are now, a younger generation following him. And I have always assumed it had something to do with the fact that he was a radical seeker of freedom. And I have no other explanation for the sort of return to glory of Harry Smith.
Incidentally, if you know Alan Lowe is sort of the Harry Smith of our time, I think,
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions or answers? I'll take an answer.
Yeah, we have another question from Daniel Brummel, which actually connects to some things you were just talking about. He doesn't want to go on mic, so I'll just read his question for him. He says, curious to hear any observations John might have on Harry's sense of spirituality, alchemy, mysticism, the occult, black magic, etc.
Well, the sore point. Look, I'd been through this with Sun Ra. Sun Ra had a collection of books, not a big one, but a very strange one. And I read them all as the best I could. And I under the idea that I could come to think like he did. I see his notes and so on and so on, his references. And by the way, they crossed paths on many things in the same zones. And yet, when I was done, I really didn't understand Sun Ra. I mean, he was much smarter than people thought, and he could draw these things together and mix them in various ways. And sometimes he's like Lenny Bruce mixed with an ancient Hebrew scholar or something. I don't know. But when I hit Harry really had read all this stuff, and he amazed everybody. He was hanging out. He learned, although he worked with a rabbi for a year recording materials. He couldn't speak Hebrew, or Yiddish for that matter, but he learned enough Hebrew to correct Hebrew in ancient text. I thought this can't be true. I gave it to a couple of scholars who very serious, who sent it to me to check with other scholars. Yes, they were right. The corrections were right. So this guy, my point is, I realized that I couldn't even get very far into the cooler, hipper stuff that the rock people got into. That itself is pretty complicated. I hung out a bit and I made notes. And I thought, I'll never live long enough to do this. So I blew it. I mean, I made the notes, but here's the thing. I'll defend myself because Harry, when he was being asked about these things, would usually say, "You don't want to hear that." or we don't have time for that, or it's all out in space anyway, or whatever, or it's a joke. And you refer sometimes to, he spent years studying Crowley, and yet he would refer to Crowley, to a young acolyte, as a bad Victorian poet. So I would say if Harry could make fun of him, so I would have to study that stuff seriously and to make fun of him in the same way. So I blew it on that. Then I've admitted to that, I think, at some point, and they're saying, at one point, I couldn't go into that, nor could I talk about the manufacture of glass, which he was very good about, or about, Sicilian puppetry, or he was a walking Wikipedia,
Online you can find some of Harry Smith's movies. I think Heaven and Earth Magic might be satisfactory to talk about the prior subject. There's also the Harry Smith archives, and they're all out there. And also, to clarify, the American Roots program, ROUTES, American Roots, is a radio program, 2 hours, with John Szwed and Jerry Garcia and a cast of many, talking about Harry Smith and a lot of the recordings from the anthology, the B-sides, and on artists covering Harry Smith from the 1950s to 2022, at least the collections that he made that people have covered. So that's what we were talking about there.
Jason, does that cover what you were asking about the American Roots, or was there more to that than that?
He may be gone.
No, you answered it. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. Going back a little bit, I'm curious. How did it, or did you get a sense from researching his early life? How did he come to have these anthropological interests as a teenager? What were the influences that got him to the point where he was bringing recording equipment out to the reservation in his mid-teens? Do you have a sense of that kind of development?
I handed that one. I got off the track at one point. I was going to try to do more with surrealism because they were running in parallel tracks. And I thought, oh boy, I can't do this. So I threw a little bit of it in, and occasionally they crisscrossed with Claude Lévi-Strauss and so forth, who Nick may not know this, but is an anthropologist. But at one point, all anthropologists, when I was young, had to do kinship charts. So he had them up on the wall framed like surreal art. Anyway, I wanted to do more with that because they were in the same waters in a way, but for different reasons. And Breton, the godfather of that stuff, Claude Lévi-Strauss, said he had no interest in the origins or how they were used. It's how he could use them or we could use them. So Northwest Coast art is really fantastic. It's multidimensional and so on. But what can we do with that? And that's a whole other story off to the side. He knew that stuff too later on. He wasn't interested in it. I think what happened with him was I got tricked a little bit. He kept talking about being a lonely kid, and that's a standard meme, right? We're all lonely kids. But he wasn't that lonely. He was hanging out with adults. And recently some stuff has surfaced of him winning prizes and awards and going to lectures, giving lectures with his mother on Indian art and stuff. So the guy was not that isolated, and I think I fell for his trap. It's like, poor Harry needs this or that. He was out there first. Now I don't. My take is only partly right. I think he wasn't hanging with the friends because people. Ronnie Singh has interviewed his friends, and they say we didn't know anything about him. I think they're faking a little bit, like you say. You don't want to talk about the nerds, who did well. We don't want to hear that. It's embarrassing. I think he ducked those people, and the Indians liked him. I mean, as ludicrous as this may seem, look. There was a guy when I went to Yale, an older scholar, who was a kid, used to hang around at powwows in Long Island and learn the dances. And one day, elders came up and said, would he be willing to go on powwows with them? He's a white kid, 12 years old, because they needed some kids and the kids didn't want to do it. So this guy became an anthropologist because a 12-year-old knew these dances. And there he was. And it's bizarre. The guy was for real. And so I think Harry had the same kind of thing. I think anthropology, Kerouac writes about these people, but he often gives them funny names, like Alfred Kroeber, the first real anthropologist of the West Coast. He was also the first lay analyst in San Francisco, and he was also translating Haussmann into German. He was hanging out with Beats. It was a cool thing to be. Anthropology is not very cool anymore, but Nick, right? It's not
Right.
Austin is not the Austin of old. God, we're old. Because now they're doing, they come up with things like the only thing anthropology is doing is fighting racism and sexism and so on. Yeah, well, how well have you done at this in the past? Number one. Well, that's not true. They actually did very well. Margaret Mead and those people really broke the rules and that stuff. But at any rate, nobody's listening to you folks anymore. But we're not interested in doing the studies of the people anymore. Folklorists aren't doing folk studies. Am I exaggerating, Nick?
Oh, well, maybe a little bit. That's okay.
Well, they're interested in big ideas. Exactly. I learned more from, thinking of someone like Archie Green said to me, Archie Green, who had been, a leftist of the first order, chained to buildings and stuff. And Archie's talking about protest songs of Dylan. He said, I'll tell you one thing, John, you'll go nowhere with a protest song if the melody's not good. He's giving me great songs with the words, but you can't sing them. He said, they were like the Star Spangled Banner. It's a great idea, but you don't want to sing it. And that was, there was, I'm getting off the track here, but yeah, I think it was all about, he'd found his audience. The guy was, I didn't make enough of this, but he refused to talk about this, what he saw. And the one place where I found he did, he stopped in the middle of it and said, I don't feel I should go on. He was keeping the secrets. So what kind of anthropologist says, yeah, I've been there, but I'm not telling you, buddy. This is just for us folks over here. But here's the other side. He's not passing as an Indian. He's not saying I'm a hippie Indian, stick a feather in my hair and do and so forth. But he stayed outside of that. Now, how do you stay outside and get inside?
Yes.
It's tough. Look, finally, I don't understand either Sun Ra or Harry. But then let someone else do that. Let them put a picture on the desk and say, I'm a Harryite.
Well, I want to thank you both very much for giving us your time. We're all admirers of both of your work, and this has been a great conversation. And I want to thank everybody who showed up today on the verge of the holiday and all of that. I know it's a busy week. So we'll be back next Tuesday, same time, with Evelyn McDonald talking about her new book on Joan Didion with Ann Powers. And yeah, good night, everybody, and thanks for coming.
Thank you very much, guys. Thank you.